there's going to be a performance here. It's not spontaneous, and it has nothing to do with anything that Donald Trump has done, because the organizers of this stuff think that, the U.S. has been a fascist regime under Reagan already.
Welcome, everyone, to Unsafe Space. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. If you want to support the show, you can go to unsafespace.com and find a bunch of ways to do that. Today, Keri and I are pleased to be speaking with David Reaboi. David is the president of Strategic Improvisation, a communications company focused on developing and executing impactful and flexible strategies for a variety of clients in the national security world. Over the last decade, he's created and grown dozens of websites and online publishing platforms, as well as run public policy and communications campaigns with budgets in the millions of dollars. As a subject matter expert, he works at the intersection of communications and policy, specializing in Sunni Islamist movements and political philosophy. He has ghostwritten or contributed to several books on the Muslim Brotherhood. He received a BA from George Washington University in International Affairs with a concentration in the history of the Cold War. He's a Claremont Institute Lincoln Fellow, and his work appears in The Federalist, Claremont Review of Books, The Washington Times, American Greatness, National Review, The Jewish Journal, Human Events, The American Mind, Red State, and PJ Media. He lives in Miami Beach, and you can find him on Twitter at Dave Reaboi, and we will put links to his Twitter and other stuff in the show notes below. David, welcome to Unsafe Space. Thank you for joining.
Great to be here. Thank you.
So, David, you are one of the more interesting people, I have to say, that I've met on Twitter. As I started to look at your bio and all the things you've done, I say interesting specifically because for me, a lot of what you do is so far outside the realm of what I know about or understand that there's a lot to read and to dive into. So thank you so much for agreeing to come on the show and talk a little bit about.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. It's flattering. I saw you on Tim Pool's show, and you were so sensible, and I was like, okay, it's nice to be able to follow someone on Twitter and to strike up a dialogue with someone who is so sensible and with whom we can hopefully have a great conversation.
So I wanted to start with, if Carter's okay with this, or Carter, I wanted to start with a piece you just wrote, because as we're bearing down on the election, being someone who has left the more radical elements of the left, I guess I would say, or the radical ideology of the left, and kind of watching how it's been ramping up as 2020 approached, I'm pretty worried about what's going to happen on election day, and I think Carter is too. And you just wrote a piece about it, which is entitled, we can link it in below, but the title is The Antifa Industry at Work. And you wrote this in American Greatness, and it's a little bit about sort of a preview of what we can expect from the left after the election. Can you tell people a little bit about this piece?
Sure. What we wanted to do was to explain that I think a lot of people, especially folks on the right, have this idea, people who live in the middle of the country or who haven't really been proximate to the radical left, they have this idea that it's just a bunch of young bums living in their parents' basements, breaking things and running amok in the streets like crazy people. The truth is that what you're seeing in those displays of violence is really just the tip of the spear of an entire industry that is very well funded, that is very deeply, deeply serious about pedagogy and about methodology in what they kind of refer to as organizing. And I came into this because I was in my kind of prior incarnation, I was a jazz musician. I lived in New York City in the Lower East Side, and I would encounter some of these people, Now, I would play music with some of these people, but even more, I mean, I played regularly at a place called the Brecht Forum in New York, named after the playwright Bertolt Brecht, the famous communist. And this place was an organizing mecca. I mean, if you Google it, I'm sure it still exists. I think it's on like 26th Street, 25th Street, something like that, just west of Fifth Avenue. And it was a loft that was where all of lefty organizing, communist organizing in New York would take place. And it was a meeting hall and a place like this. I mean, think of it like your local Knights of Columbus, but for communists. And you would see, and hey, the music they had was great. It was fantastic. But I used to go in and I would kind of look around, and there was one other day I went in to use the bathroom at a kind of Tibetan incense shop in the Lower East Side, and I walk in and it's all these people making the most blood-curdling anti-Semitic, anti-Israel posters. And they're talking about, the Jews, and they're talking about the right of return and some of these things. And, as someone who has always been, who is Jewish, who's always been a conservative and who's always been a Zionist, I was looking and like, this is the stuff that you would see on TV, on CNN being shown on the other side of the world. But we have this in New York. When I lived in San Francisco, I went to a party at some space, and I went looking for the bathroom. I opened a door, and there was a massive room full of the George Bush and Donald Rumsfeld puppets that they used to go and in San Francisco they had Iraq War protests all the time, and they had these massive like car-sized puppet, inflatable, balloons, George Bush with the Dracula teeth and the blood and all this stuff. And I was getting an education. I was just looking around, and to me it was shocking how, by all accounts, let's say the most generous I could be is that their politics was way out of the mainstream and considered, highly radical at the time in the United States. At the time. That politics is exactly the politics of San Francisco that I encountered in New York City, but really San Francisco and Berkeley that I encountered back in the early 2000s is what we're dealing with on a kind of mainstream level right now.
I want to jump in there just for a second and say that has been completely my experience. When I was pushing wokeness, it was just in those. I was in probably some of those circles that was doing the puppet theater. I was at all the anti-war protests, but my ideology was sort of relegated to the radical academic kind of world, or the artsy kind of world, and it certainly wasn't mainstream. And in the past 2 years, I think it's ramped up a lot, and especially in the past 6 months or so. And now I see it. Carter and I talk about this all the time. So corporations are speaking it. They're speaking the words. Mm-hmm. All of our corporations, media, social media, legacy media, both, but it's everywhere now. And I never could have imagined it. The old version of me would probably be ecstatic. It's not exactly how I'm feeling about it right now, but I think you really hit the nail on the head there. And there was something else you said. You said that conservatives seem to have an idea of Antifa types or whatever being these young
losers.
Basement dwelling. That's an outdated idea. That's an idea from the Jon Stewart days. It's sort of people that are stuck in the 90s or the early 2000s.
Right. I was listening to actually my co-writer on this piece, Kyle Scheidler, who's probably he testified in Congress on Antifa as an Antifa expert, and he made a point that what we're seeing now is kind of, especially around the election, we're seeing the last gasp of the boomer radicals. And we're talking about a small group, small is in the thousands or the tens of thousands, but a group of radicals who came up through SDS. They came up through, they were in organizing, they were in, kind of semi-violent groups in the early 70s. By the mid to late 70s, they transitioned already into teaching schools or places like the Northwest Academy, where they basically became Bill Ayers, which is Bill Ayers is like the most celebrated theorist of education today, and he's an academic, and but they always kept their foot in sort of direct action. And so you see the same people. I mean, just the other night, I was watching someone had surreptitiously recorded a 3-hour lecture Zoom thing with Lisa Fithian. I don't know if when you were on the left, if you ran into her, but she's another one, aging boomer who is a veteran of every possible protest movement you can think of. And these people are dead serious, and they sit and they write books about organizing. Many of them work for unions, for large labor unions. We're not talking about the union membership. We're talking about the people who work there. And the other component that is kind of new is probably the last 15 years or so, is the fact that you have professional PR firms, like let's say small to mid-sized firms of 10 people, maybe even 20 people, budgets in $5-10 million, and they are getting money in order to help amplify these radical voices. So that's something new. That's something that's a kind of new ingredient that was not in the left's toolkit way back when. I mean, I'm sure when you were out there, you were protesting the war, you were involved in this. People were doing. People were just doing this on the fly. They were calling journalists. They were asking, this and that. Now we have PR shops that are dedicated to doing this, and it feeds right into. I mean, you just mentioned the companies. The companies are giving to some of these nonprofits. Mm-hmm. The nonprofits are siphoning, the larger foundation nonprofits are siphoning the money off to the smaller groups. One of these groups, or many of these groups, are these PR firms. I mean, where do you think, if somebody gives $10 million to BLM, where does that go? That doesn't go necessarily all to buy, bricks and implements to throw and break things. It also buys PR firms. It buys people who have relationships with reporters. It buys reporters, and it's a massive infrastructure that, let's say, the right doesn't have. So to end by throwing it back at you, as someone who left the left, how does it feel? I think of sort of the most celebrated book about a political transition, I think, is Witness, the Whittaker Chambers book.
I don't know that book.
It's the most, it's kind of maybe the most famous book of the Cold War. And it was Whittaker Chambers, who was Time magazine editor, used to be a communist, and decides to leave. And really it was a kind of religious awakening that he had, together with the fact that he came out against communism, and he was really very, very deeply hated. And he wrote an autobiography about this particular transition that he made called Witness, that was Ronald Reagan's favorite book, and it was kind of, a lot of people read it. It was a bestseller. And it's a sad book because on one hand, he realizes that, he's glad that he left the left. He's glad that he left communism, which at that time was CPUSA, which, like, you know, before the new left, it was, they really had their hands on your throat. But on the other hand, he was firmly convinced that the West will lose.
Wow.
So the book is dealing with these two conflicting things. He's like, you know, I had to, you know, it's like going and you know, switching sides, and then knowing that the side you're switching to is pretty much doomed. And so that was my question for you. It's like, do you feel like Whittaker Chambers, or do you, because we're in a situation where you've got, you know, you've got a lot of forces arrayed against us.
Yes. Well, Carter was never on the radical left like I was, but I guess he would be a Whittaker Chambers in terms of, you're a little bit more convinced that the West is doomed, that we can save elements of it, but not the United States. Is that right, Carter, or am I putting words in your mouth?
Yeah, I would say that the United States was killed a long time ago, and we just don't know it yet.
Yeah, I don't necessarily agree with Carter on that. I guess I maintain a hope that, what's interesting you say, Whittaker, that he also had a religious awakening, because leaving the SJW left coincided with this spiritual or God-seeking awakening in me as well. Those two things were happening almost simultaneously. And I think probably because of my belief in God, it gives me this sense of hope, or I just kind of feel like there's politics and there's what's happening in the US, but there's this bigger story that's playing out that makes me feel kind of like rest easy, even when my rational mind tells me not to. My heart says it's okay. And I guess an atheist might say, well, that's just something comforting.
I should clarify. I don't think the West is dead. I think the United States in its current incarnation is dead. Right? So I don't think the ideas of Western civilization are dead, because there are still a lot of people who hold those ideas true, and I think would be willing to sacrifice something in order to make those ideas continue in some fashion. But do I see a United States in which we change direction? We've never changed direction in my entire life. We've always been marching to the left. Do I see suddenly the United States, oh, hey, let's go back to small government, that was a great idea? No, I don't. And I think you'd have to be smoking something pretty strong to think that's going to happen.
So have you read Michael Anton's new book called The Stakes? Or have you heard about it?
I haven't. I read his Flight 93 essay, which I thought was spot on in many ways, and kind of captured why I voted for Trump, actually. But
I would recommend checking that book out, because that what you just articulated is his basic thesis. But he goes, you know, obviously it's at book length, but it's very, very well written argument along those precise lines, and it's a point of view that I share. So I think we're you know, at least you know, we're two of us in agreement here about the future of the United States.
I don't know. It depends on a day-to-day basis, David, honestly. Some days I feel more pessimistic and other days I feel more optimistic. But sometimes I do definitely think we're probably heading towards some type of, like, I think the only thing that could bring us together right now as Americans would be something awful, unfortunately. Something awful.
You think there is something awful that would bring everyone together as opposed to break it apart in a final way? I can't imagine anything that would bring us together. I mean, if 9/11 happened today, there's no way of.
Wow.
You know.
Okay, that's what I was.
I mean, that's
my.
I mean, that's my opinion. I mean, look at what happened. There's nothing that won't be politicized today. Look at what happened with the virus. I think by any stretch, it was a new situation, an unprecedented situation that, you know, frankly, I mean, did Trump do what I would have liked him to do? No. Do I blame him all that much? Not really, because he was really flying blind, you know, and any criticism from Democrats about the virus, I think, is just stupid and disingenuous, because they haven't, at all times they wanted him to do more of what he did that was bad. And and they don't really have a point, but still, because we're in a world where it's all partisanship all the time, even that is politicized, even that is used to an advantage. If you follow the rhetoric, and this has been true for a few years, but if you follow the rhetoric of the left about the right, about they've been calling us, there's a difference between calling us racist, sexist, homophobic, Islamophobic, yada yada, and saying that we are a national security threat. Mm-hmm. There's a sharp line between those two things. It may not feel that way, but there is, because when they start saying you guys are a national security threat, then they start creating the predicate for taking action.
Well, but they've already kind of created that predicate, though, right? I mean, when you talk about, I don't know, one thing that really strikes me when you talk about this apparently grassroots Antifa movement, right? You talk about how it's orchestrated from these other institutions, and you mentioned kind of the boomers and their last gasp at trying to do something.
Right.
What immediately springs to mind for me is the Cultural Revolution in China, which looked like it was grassroots student movements, students being upset, seizing power, and was very chaotic, but actually was completely orchestrated, not completely, but largely orchestrated, not in minute detail, but goaded in the right direction constantly by people in power. Right. Mao's wife and the rest of the CCRG, right?
Right. So it's a familiar dynamic. It's a familiar dynamic, and I mean, we wrote the piece as a warning, because we don't think that the right knows at all what it's up against, number one. And number two is it's going to get, we wanted to point out that regardless of what happens on Election Day, there will be protests. They've told us there will be protests. They've begun to put those gears in motion. So when they're, so the audience should know that the existence of protests means nothing about the election, other than a bunch of leftists have decided to protest. Nothing structural has changed. This has just been their plan, number one. And number two is, these guys are very good at mobilization. The right is terrible at it.
Yeah.
So when they see, and why do they mobilize? Why do they want to get, 1 million people into the streets? Because that 1 million people amplified in media and on TV will seem like it's the whole country who is demonstrating.
Yeah.
And right. So they want to create something that looks larger than it is. So in preparation for that, we need to know, hey, what they're doing now is going to be theater. There's going to be a performance here. It's not spontaneous, and it has nothing to do with anything that Donald Trump has done, because the organizers of this stuff think that, the U.S. has been a fascist regime under Reagan already, or Carter.
Right.
One of the things you talked about in that piece is the Transition Integrity Project. And Carter and I have only, I think, talked about it once, kind of briefly. Can you tell people a little bit about what the Transition Integrity Project is and how it's laying the groundwork for these protests?
Sure. That is an ad hoc project by the Defending Democracy Project, which is, so they got a bunch of folks together, they being a guy named Niles Gilman of the Berggruen Institute, which is a China-linked sort of smart set think tank that has its fingers in a number of pots on one hand. On the other hand, you have Rosa Brooks, who is a former Soros official. Someone told me the other day, interestingly enough, that Rosa Brooks's mom was a big SDS organizer. So with many of these people, it's already it's second generation stuff.
And SDS, for anyone catching up, that's Students for Democratic Socialism, right?
For Democratic Society.
Society, okay.
Yeah, and that was and it's sort of the premier New Left group that was supposed to be nonviolent. SDS today exists in the Squad. Mm-hmm. When we think of what SDS is, that's AOC. And frankly, AOC would be very happy to fly under that moniker. So it's not something that she's necessarily being accused of. So the Transition Integrity Project was a sort of pickup group and of people on the left and never Trumpers and people who, for lack of a better way of describing them, they're the consummate establishment deep state folks. I know that a lot of people went kind of mad when I think it was Rush Limbaugh first used the word deep state to describe some of these folks. But really what deep state, we're not talking about the Turkish or Egyptian deep state. The U.S. deep state is the national security branch of the administrative state. It has a meaning. It's totally a thing. The Beltway is full of people who may not understand themselves as operating within an ecosystem, but that doesn't mean the ecosystem doesn't exist. So folks like Bill Kristol and folks like what's his name? Tony Podesta, or John Podesta. Folks like Michael Steele and a bunch of these other folks got together and they did a war game simulation of what would happen in a contested election, and then they ran several scenarios, and then they decided to write a long report. It's about 30 pages summary of what it is, and then they went and hit the media, and they concluded in one of the scenarios, they concluded that the United States, that California, Oregon, and Washington would secede from the United States in event of a Trump victory. Another scenario was that the military would remove Donald Trump by force from the White House because he wouldn't accept, blah, blah, blah. So the only scenario wherein there was not some complete meltdown of American society and government was a clear Biden victory.
I noticed that they had. Yeah. Isn't it true that they had 4 scenarios and only one of those scenarios was a decisive Trump victory, and the rest were all it concluded with Biden winning?
I didn't think they had any decisive Trump victories. I thought all scenarios.
Oh, really?
They didn't.
Oh,
they didn't.
Okay.
Yeah, they totally right. The only scenario where the country didn't end up in flames, literally, was a clear Biden victory, which I think, honestly, at this point, all of us assume, this. I know that this is. I'm not sure when it's going to be broadcast, but I'm assuming before the election. Yeah. Probably the least likely of the scenarios is a clear Biden victory at this point, I think.
Right. But one of these things, they're setting this up so that there is they're prepping people psychologically so that there is no conceivable way. If Trump wins, it must be because of it must be an ill-gotten win in some way. There's no possible way he wins other than through nefarious means.
Right. Yeah. So it's one thing for them to conclude that, right? It's another thing completely to do a media blitz telling the world that. So at that point, you have to wonder, why are they doing this? It's not a bunch of guys sitting around trying to legitimately game out scenarios. Some of my colleagues participated in a similar type of war game trying to figure out if there's anything we're missing in examining the situation. And, we're not putting it out and giving people details about what happened and blah, 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 blah. You have to ask, why did they do that? And I think they did that. I think they did that to prepare the ground, as you said, to prepare the ground for an eventual scenario where they're convinced by hook or by crook that Donald Trump is not going to legitimately win. So they're just going to run the play. I think they're going to run the play regardless. I don't think they have it within their capacity or imagination to imagine a scenario where it's a clear Trump victory, where they're really going to have to say, where they're really going to have to go against overwhelming evidence of a Trump victory to run this kind of what other people have called color revolution play.
Well, they'll be able to make it not a clear victory by questioning, no matter what it is. They will have their pundits, and they have the entire cathedral talking about voter fraud or whatever.
They'll be talking about voter fraud. They'll be talking about voter intimidation.
Right.
When I started thinking about this, immediately I saw that Pennsylvania and Philadelphia in particular is going to be the flashpoint of this election. You can see it a mile away because Pennsylvania is essential to both campaigns. Number one. Number two is it's really a red state with with a giant blue dot in it. Maybe two, and to smaller ones to a lesser extent. But Philadelphia itself is where you're going to have to make up votes to balance out the rest of the state. The other parts of the state. So and frankly, in Philadelphia, you've got a situation where you already have decades of folks on the ground doing organizing, lefty organizing in Philadelphia. You know exactly what to do, how to the infrastructure is built. You just press the button and you get kind of leftist direct action in Philadelphia. So it's not like they're not about to go and set up shop in Houston or to do something like that outside of their zone. But Philadelphia is perfect. So we're gonna I would say
Well, they're already having rioting there now.
Yes.
How does that play into it? Because I've seen some people suggesting that the legacy media and the social media companies are purposefully throttling coverage of those riots. Do you think that's happening?
Yeah, I think that's happening. I think I thought that the rioting would stop within 24 hours because the Antifa guys would call up the BLM guys and say, you know what, cool it for a couple days because you're not doing us any favors. But apparently what's happening is, as you said, the social media companies are saying, you know what, we're just not going to show this. And they can do it. You can get into a situation where half the country will be burning, but they won't show it. And it reminds me of the opening scene in the Gilliam film Brazil, which is just a kind of key film, for the times that we're living in. But it's basically, you see, what they call terror attacks all around, literally taking place right there. And a TV broadcast is like, oh, nothing, everything is fine. You know what I'm talking about. The scene, right? Yeah. Yes. The opening scene. So the media just doesn't cover the reality of the situation, and that obviously, understatement of the year is it doesn't bode well for the future of social cohesion, or the health of a nation.
Yeah, you've talked a little bit about that there is this color revolution potential that could be happening, but I think a lot of people, when you talk about there being people kind of pulling the strings behind the scenes, it sounds like to some people, I think it sounds like a ridiculous kind of conspiracy theory, like, oh, there's there's men in a room smoking cigars telling Antifa what to do, and that's not really the case in that sense. However, you've talked about how they use multiple tactics so they can have.
They're vegans. They don't smoke.
Right? Yeah. Yeah. Fair enough.
They're eating carrots. They're telling you.
Yeah. But you've mentioned people like Hardy Merriman, who has like actual expertise in overthrowing governments through this, and you've talked about how they have an intentional strategy of multiple tactics, so you can have the people who get their hands dirty, and then the level of people who support them, but not kind of overtly. They don't criticize them. Can you go into a little bit of how that works so that it sounds less conspiratorial to people and have people have a better understanding of what's going on?
Sure. So as you correctly point out, it's not like there are a bunch of people that say, "Hey, we're going to do this." I mean, a conspiracy theory is a bunch of people that get together and plan to do X, right? Let's say a group of contractors who get together and build an apartment building. That's not a conspiracy. That's what people do for a living. So that's what we're dealing with here. We're dealing with people that you wake up in the morning, you're literally getting paid. This is what you've done for 30 years. This is your job, is to overthrow the government. And that's the job of people like Lisa Fithy, and that's the job of every one of these people in one way or another. I mean, that was the job of Barack Obama when he was in Chicago, when he was community organizing. It's just a matter of who your target is, because your target is going to respond to the same, you're basically going to run a similar play in order to address different audiences, different concerns. But as you said, and you brought up diversity of tactics, which is let's say a system that allows a different that allows several different types of people to get together and all array against one common enemy.
Yes.
And what it does is it makes it so that your differences are kind of deprioritized. And a lot of people, for example, on the right will fight against one another. And I know that, sort of earlier in my career studying the Muslim Brotherhood and these groups, terrorist groups, they all fight. They all have personal drama on one hand, and on the other hand, they all have ideological reasons for why these guys don't like. I mean, it's just like the Monty Python scene with the United Front of Judea or whatever. Mm-hmm. People who are serious about politics and the micro points are obsessive about it. So these little differences make a very big deal. So how does the leftists solve this problem? The leftists solve this problem by saying, okay, you guys, you nonviolent guys, you're squeamish. You guys don't like blood. You guys hang out over here and you can do X. The guys who like blood, here's some shit kickers. You want to go, all you do is fight. You don't have brains. You just want to bash some people's heads in. You go. Yes. And you go here. And, and we'll get a bunch of people, you middle-aged women, you look like soccer moms. Okay, great. We're going to use you. We're going to dress you up as soccer moms against Trump. And we're going to put you on the front line so that the media sees you. Another group, you guys are going to work with the PR agency, and you're going to make sure that these people are photographed from one angle only. There's an art to this, and I can say, as someone I have done things like this on the right. literally things exactly like this on the right and in kind of different ways for different clients and things like that. It's a thing. It's a skill set, and you need a tremendous amount of money to pull it off, and you need a tremendous amount of human capital to pull it off. So
you need a docile and already thoroughly brainwashed group of people. And I think we're at that point of, lately I've been watching a lot of documentaries about cults because they've been interesting to me and helping me see my old ideology in a different way. And I think in some ways, social justice ideology, or whatever you want to call it, the regressive left, this identity-based Marxism, it functions like a cult, but it's harder, I think, for people to see that they're in it, because there are a couple differences between this kind of cult, this kind of ideological cult, and a cult that might all come to mind, like the Jim Jones or the Kool-Aid drinkers,
Sure.
or Scientology. Those cults have charismatic leaders. People can draw differences and say, no, this is so different. We don't have XYZ, but it does check off all the other characteristics. and when you're in it, it's almost like they can get people to. I've had trouble describing this myself. It's they get people to move like a school of fish, and it's not like guys in a smoky room with cigars or carrots or whatever just planning it out. It's just you kind of fall in line organically with what you're comfortable doing. And so when I was in it, I would have been in the group of the people online who, in my career in entertainment and in my online posts, was doing my tiny, small part to push the ideology forward, and try and provide academic justifications and emotional justifications for people. So I wouldn't be the person rioting, but I would be the person writing, maybe, perhaps, as we've seen people do, writing books in defense of looting or articles in defense of rioting, and trying to make it sound like it's okay and smooth it over and justify it and help people swallow it. And so I definitely see that happening. You see Antifa and BLM acting as the muscle for this movement in the streets, or the ones committing violence. But then you see a much larger group of people in the media and in social media who are carrying water for them and are justifying what they're doing and sort of mainstreaming it, making it seem normal. And then you get to the point where you have someone like Joe Biden saying it's not even a movement, it's just an idea. Like it's not a movement, it's just an idea. How it's they as much as they want to try and say Trump has given a wink and a nod, I struggle to see how they don't see that as a wink and a nod from Joe Biden. Like, Antifa is just an idea. It's like, keep on doing what you're doing. I'm not actually in the street committing violence myself, guys. I'm Joe Biden, but
yes, But that's not right. No, I mean, the point that you brought up earlier is such a good point, and it's something that I was thinking about when kind of we first scheduled this, which is that, and here's the difference. I always say that people on the left kind of they want to be, by temperament, they want to be muckrakers. They want to be like they see themselves in an ecosystem, like exactly what you just described. You're like, okay, I'm not going to be the one out there, busting heads, but my, like, to borrow another phrase, my personal jihad is, is of the pen, where I sit down and I do what you do. Versus on the right, really everybody wants to be George Will. Either everybody wants to be George Will, or now I guess everybody wants to be Ben Shapiro, Charlie Kirk, that type of person who just basically opines. Okay, I'm a guy who opines.
Okay.
But
I see.
But there's it's like I think on the left there's a sense that I'm doing my part as a cog in this bigger machine.
Yes.
I am working in a bigger machine, which means I don't have to, I don't have to be, Van Jones or Ibram Kendi or one of the big stars. I can just go and do my thing, which is why you see, which is why, they've taken over things like Wikipedia.
Yeah. Because there's people that's what they love doing.
That's what they love to do. Exactly.
By the way,
right.
David, okay, guilty admission, Carter already knows this. Okay. I spent time doing that as an SJW. I went in and altered definitions for rape, Christopher Columbus. I was one of the first people to this is embarrassing and maybe you'll hate me. I was one of the first people to try and redo the wording and such to include a lot of sort of racist writings that Columbus had done about the natives and to sort of denigrate him as a figure. And some of my stuff I think is still there, like 10 years later.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so you are smart. So that makes you smarter than 90% of the people on the right because you understand that that's important.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Because
right.
You're changing definitions. You're changing cultural public perception.
Yes. Okay. So a friend of mine told me about a speech that George Soros gave in the 2000s, and someone asked him about conservative philanthropists, and he laughed and he was like, these guys are jokers. They all think that the point of philanthropy is to, is like to make a profit or to make something that's like, is to get a return on their investment. He's like, no, this is philanthropy. You flood the zone. You put soldiers in the field and they do things like edit Wikipedia. And if you've got 500 of these people, they can cover Wikipedia.
Yeah.
And they, people who wake up, I always say this, we need people who wake up in the morning and say, this is my goal within this is my task within this finite boundary. This is what I'm going to do. This is what I'm going to spend my and we just don't have that. We have something else, but we don't have an understanding of that. So that's one of my long-term frustrations because while I saw it from the outside in and I tried to read their writings, you saw it from experience. I mean, you were there, you were doing it. So do you think, so you haven't seen sort of on the right or on the center an analog to that kind of that kind of effort, have you?
No, because, and maybe I'm just not in the right circles to have seen it. I think on the right, there's a better culture of people who do memes, who engage in kind of silly juvenile humor. And I do think that memes have the ability to change minds. Humor has the ability to change minds. I worked in comedy when I was in SJW because I knew the power of comedy to get people to swallow ideas while you're making them laugh, and I do think the right is better at that than the left currently in terms of meme making. And that's why you see social media companies like Twitter censoring funny memes and saying, well, you can't do the NPC meme and you can't do the hashtag learn to code, and you can't do these funny things that are illuminating truth. But when it comes to like waking up and deciding we're going to control the narrative on Wikipedia and we're going to insert our version of the world in the dictionary, and we're going to lobby the dictionary.com every day and lobby Merriam-Webster's until they give in and bend and change the definition. No, I don't see them doing that. I don't see them doing, we used to do anytime the press, I was one of the feminist nonprofits I was on the board of. It was called Women Action in the Media. And we would get all of our members to target what seemed like very small things. But anytime a newspaper or anytime a media outlet described the way a female politician on the left, we only cared about the left. Anytime they described the way a female politician on the left looked, we would have all of our members send them how dare you? This is sexist. This is lookism. You can't use that word for women. You can't use the word shrill. You can't use, and we got some publications to issue apologies. Over the long term, that does change the way. And then you see now the fruits of all that. The AP is issuing style in their style book. It's certain words you can't use. You can't use the word mistress. You're not allowed to do this. I was also a member of an immigration social justice group where we were heavily pushing the same thing. Anytime a media outlet used the word illegal when talking about illegal immigrants, we would do letter writing campaigns. No human is illegal. You must call them undocumented Americans. They live here, they work here, they're Americans. Undocumented, undocumented, undocumented. What's the importance of doing that? Well, over time, you get the media to, you're changing, like Orwell said, you're changing language, which changes thought.
When in 2004 and 2005, when I was in San Francisco arguing with lunatics in coffee shops, I first heard "no human being is illegal," and I started to laugh because I was like, this is your argument. This is your I was like, this is the level of argument that's just I shouldn't even have to respond to it. It's so dumb.
Yeah,
and
it works.
But it works. You need to clip what you just said, your last answer, and really put it online, because I don't think people understand the nuts and bolts. I mean, we didn't do this in the article, at all, but you just kind of described it. People don't understand what organizing means. When they say lefty organizing, it doesn't necessarily mean getting 50 people to show up in a street corner. It means exactly what you were talking about. It means creating these identifying the pressure points, right? Which is with the sexist point, you knew you weren't going to waste time going after you weren't going to waste time defending Sarah Palin's honor or whatever.
Right.
You identify right. You identify. You could give two shits about what they said about her, but you're going to have your list of lefty women, and if anyone uses comments that are construed as sexist about any of those women, then you notify these people, you nag them. But you're nagging on, they have a tremendous advantage, as because that person on the receiving end of those emails is already predisposed to support you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so in that respect, we've come a long way from the early days of like Alinsky type organizing, when the person on the other end of the phone, who would be receiving these complaints is, someone who would be more conservative, or someone who would be like a captain of industry type, who would, who's kind of like firmly establishment, you guys would call, SJWs would call them, whatever, reactionary, type guy chomping on a big cigar, But now companies are being run by, and the media firms are being run by people who are already SJWs.
Yeah.
Or one step away. And
that goes back,
it takes this much.
That goes back to what you were saying about how a lot of conservatives, and I think you're right, as I've met more people on the right in the past 4 years, a lot of them have this idea, and I've even heard them say in our comments, Carter, when they'll say, well, they'll kind of make fun of people who are studying social justice at university, and they'll say, yeah, but these kids, they're never going to get a job when they're going to be living in their parents' basements. I'm like, no. They're going to get jobs. All of the people who were indoctrinated 20 years ago, when I was indoctrinated, got jobs. And guess where they got them? In media, entertainment. They're running Google. They're running BuzzFeed. They're running CNN. They're doing social justice warriors can get jobs. And the fact that you're underestimating it.
I mean, the question for me is,
right.
Yeah, I was like, my question is, I guess I have a couple questions. One is, why does the right, I mean, I think Michael Anton also complained about, I don't think he used the phrase, they all want to be George Will, but he's complained about a similar thing on the right. And I guess my question is like, fundamentally they shouldn't get jobs because they don't produce anything. So I think, like, I understand that sentiment of someone who looks at that and says, well, there's no productive value in that degree. And that is true. There is no, existentially, it's not a productive task. But if you're in clown world in which Jack Dorsey is willing to spend millions of dollars on unproductive tasks and you have a degree in that particular unproductive task, well, then you get a job.
It's no longer unproductive.
Right.
It's no longer unproductive. Right. I mean, if he's torquing the incentives in such a way, it's no longer a non-productive job. There is a path to. There are a lot of paths that are available to you on the left that are just not available to you on the right.
Yeah.
If and this is kind of veering off to the side a little bit, but we don't have media organs that are at all the same. We don't have a kind of conveyor belt that builds public intellectuals like the left has. A guy like Kendi or whatever. There's a circuit of people. It's not very difficult. You just have to have, conventional wisdom, lefty opinions, and you can go and if you've got a PhD and conventional opinions, you can go and you can do a book and then really on anything as long as it's within the bounds of ideology, and they'll go and they'll fly you from one conference to the next. They'll give you an endowed chair somewhere, and basically you're good to go. And they recognize you as they credential you. And the left is very good at credentialing. The right is terrible at it at all levels. And this is how they understand putting soldiers in the field. It's not only someone who is who sits and edits Wikipedia all day. It's not someone who puts together, who builds puppets for mass rallies. It's also, it's also the conveyor belt of folks that start out on lefty blogs. I mean, look who writes for the New York Times today. Straight journalists, I mean. The straight journalists today who write for the New York Times used to write for far left blogs 5 years ago.
And longer. I remember a lot of the small sort of, again, at the time considered on the fringe lefty blogs that I followed, like Feministing, which was it became one of the most popular feminist blogs. A lot of those writers, Jessica Valenti, they came from that blog, and now they write for the New York Times. Right.
No, I mean it's ridiculous. There was, I mean, there's so many of these people that it's hard even to. But you would never see the same of someone on the right. Like if you started with a diary on Red State, and you maintained your conservative politics, and then you wind up at the New York Times. That's insane. Even to say it is at the absurdity of it. But I mean you've got who was good. There's so many good examples. You start off with some rinky-dink lefty blog, totally extreme. You start off with a Daily Kos diary. You go, you get yourself a job here. You go at Talking Points Memo, then you're at Vox, and then finally you matriculate up to the New York Times, where you're paid $200,000 a year, and it's and what that is that's just credentialing. And it's a thing that people on the right don't have. And we wonder, people on the right get upset at folks who are constantly looking for approval in some of those journals. The folks like like David French or Seth Mandel, wherever, whenever mainstream lefty media needs a conservative to denounce conservatives, there are a bunch of people that eagerly raise their hands in order to do that task. Well, they know that they've gone as far up on the food chain in the right leaning ecosystem as they can. So if they want to climb up, if they want to go up, if they want to get a better job or more money or prestige or whatever, they only have the left to go to. And as everything, and I'm all over the place today, so you have to forgive me. But when at the bottom line to all of this is it's a failure of right-wing philanthropy. It's a failure of conservative donors over the course of 30 years.
That was going to be my question: is what is the difference? Yeah. Because not just what's the difference between why is there this pipeline on the left for credentialing people that doesn't exist on the right? That's one question. And then the other question is, why do people psychologically, why are people on the right not as inclined to wake up and edit Wikipedia? I'll tell you, since I love social justice ideology, yeah. I haven't edited Wikipedia once. I don't have any motivation to. I kind of feel like it's manipulative. So I don't know.
Right. Well, yeah, instead you're like, hey, I'm going to do a podcast.
Yeah.
And that makes sense. No, I mean, that makes total sense. That makes total sense. I've thought about this for a long time when I started working in conservative, what Anton would call, conservative Inc. And this whole, you can't really say Inc., but let's say the archipelago of conservative think tanks and nonprofits, dealing with a lot of donors from very, very big to very small. At the end of the day, it's easy. It's much easier for the left because they're all pushing in one direction. They may not have a particular policy goal in mind, but the idea of equality, the idea, as defined by a leftist, the idea of, the march for progress, I'm not entirely sure what they have in mind when they close their eyes and they imagine, I'm not sure. I mean, I should probably ask you, what did you have in mind when you closed your eyes? Because I'll tell you, on the conservative side, there is no agreement. Some people want to go back to 1954. Some people want 1984. Some people want, God knows what. And for that reason, that makes things harder. But I mean, did you on the left have you closed your eyes at night, you're imagining your utopia? What does that look like?
So there was a book I read in women's studies at Duke. It was called Woman on the Verge of Time. And it's supposed to be presented as a sort of a feminist social justice utopia, a futuristic novel, sci-fi kind of novel. And it's actually, I want to reread it now because now what I remember of it, it was chilling. Because in this future, they were presenting it as a utopia, but from what I recall, it's very dystopian. It's a little bit like Brave New World. They didn't intend it to be alarming, but in this future world, children are raised by a community, and they make sure that community is very diverse racially and sex and sexuality wise. And they view the parental, like a two-parent home, as being detrimental to humans and, giving you all this socialization. Everything is, a social construct. And so if they can break down the parental unit, then they can deprogram, they can make sure all the socialization that's so evil doesn't happen. But to be honest, David, I actually don't think that a lot of people, and I certainly didn't spend a lot of time thinking about it, because the goal itself, what you're fighting, is your purpose. And you can't actually imagine it ending. Like, I couldn't have imagined this social justice ideology getting to the point where it is now. I always thought, because you're taught to see yourself as, and they all see themselves as this David figure, David and Goliath. They see it as they're the resistance. When they're actually, it's become mainstream. It's the status quo, but they still see themselves as this little beleaguered resistance, and it makes them feel like it's this noble cause. And also the ideology tells you that you'll never see an end to racism and sexism and all these isms they think they're fighting. You're never going to eradicate them. You're always going to be fighting. The fight never ends. Even when you die, they don't have the decency to say rest in peace. They say rest in power. It's all about power. You
Right.
can't. They don't even let you rest in peace. You're still fighting for power from beyond the grave, But it's the
Yeah,
continual.
Look, it's no accident that all of that the New Left is, I mean, the New Left was built by students of Heidegger. That's not an accident. So they see, they see will to power.
So
As think,
I've
but
got a question for you though, because
yeah,
I'm sure you've heard this from Michael Malice. It's one of the most succinct and damning descriptions of conservatism, and accurate, that I can think. And I'm not a conservative. I haven't been a conservative for maybe when I was really young. So 25 years. He says conservatism is progressivism driving the speed limit. And
right.
I look at the left for the past several decades, even just in my lifetime, and I say, yes, they've gotten more radical. Yes, I think they're unhinged now. I think it's because they think they've won. They don't need to play the game anymore. So they can just do their thing. They think they've won. And maybe they have. But they've always been philosophically pretty Marxist, even if they didn't know it. They didn't know it, but their principles were pretty collectivist, anti-individualist. They've always been that way. Always. With some exceptions. They had some exceptions for, like, we like porn and stay out of our bedroom, but, like, generally Marxists. And the conservatives, I really don't know what they stand for. They always seem to stand for, like, well, can we go more slowly? There's no principled stance. So it's not a surprise to me that the conservatives lost, because I don't know what the hell battle they've been fighting this whole time. Can you explain that to me?
Yeah. So what you're describing is the conservative donor.
Okay.
And the conservative donor, or the universe of conservative donors, create the incentives for where all this is. A good example will be, regardless of how you feel about this particular issue, but Paul Singer, who I'm sure Elliott Management, venture capital guy, is a big, has historically been a big kind of establishment conservative donor. His son is gay, and he went on a mission to change the view of gay marriage on the right, because of his son.
Right.
I mean, I guess he's free to do that, but I'm just giving it to you as an example on what kind of things. One very wealthy donor who's very involved and very committed to any particular issue can fundamentally change the universe of conservative media and think tanks and activism, through giving money. Look what's happened. I can't think of a better example. I shouldn't have used that. I should have used the example of the Koch guys.
Right. They're ones that bother me.
Right. The Koch guys, together with the tech companies, to do this thing. Conservative philanthropists have spent 30 years trying to tell Republican voters that the greatest Americans of all have been titans of industry, and mega billionaires and stuff like that.
I'm getting just a little lost. Could you guys tell me what did the Koch brothers do?
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, I just don't.
You want to take it?
No, go ahead. I mean, yeah.
Okay. So the Koch brothers are not conservative, and they've been described as libertarians. They've been on the forefront of a bunch of issues, from criminal justice reform to immigration, their open borders. They are also sort of instrumental in this situation we find ourselves in with big tech, which is they're making the argument that this is Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, every major social media network in the world censoring you is fine because it's a private business.
Wow. Okay.
And so this is the kind of thing that they're doing. Okay, so how do they do it? They do it by saying to, let's say conservative publication A, they'll say, "Hi, we have a Koch fellow. Would you like to hire him? Oh, don't worry. It won't cost you money. We're going to pay for it. He's just going to be on your editorial board now. He's going to wake up in the morning, and every day he's going to write a piece about how the big tech companies and Section 230 and the Communications Decency Act is just fine, shouldn't be changed, don't do it, blah, 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 blah." Every day, boom, boom, he's hammering it. And there's no disclosure.
Wow.
Let's say you go, and what does it matter to these guys? These guys have all the money in the world. What they're shy about spending $100,000 on a person, so they'll buy 10 of them.
Right.
So at every publication, you've got maybe 2 or 3 people who are literally on the payroll, and their job is just to reflect the sort of corporate, the policy of their donors. And I'm not saying these people who are hired, who are the writers, don't believe that. They're hired because they can make the case, and because they believe it. But still, what you're getting, what the average consumer of that news is getting, is manipulation. You're not getting someone who wakes up in the morning and says, I'm going to consider these issues. You're not getting a heterodox conservative scene. You're getting what donors have paid for.
They're paying them for their point of view.
Yeah. So I mean, there are folks out there that do this, on the down low. There are folks that do this in public. It's not a secret who some of these folks are.
I mean, let me see how this strikes you. It seems to me that the left. We can sit back all day and say that the left is unprincipled, and certainly in many of their actions. I mean, Saul Alinsky's playbook is specifically rejects principled behavior.
Dedicated to unprincipled, yeah.
Right. However, there is my impression of the left is there's a general sense of moral fortitude. Like they're sure that they're right morally. There's some kind of moral, this is the right direction to go, and we're all kind of aligned with this. So when Keri sits down to edit Wikipedia, she's got moral conviction that this is the right direction the country needs to move. And when the Antifa is smashing people's face, there's the right direction. There's moral certainty there. But on the right, it seems to me that the conservatives conceded the moral points a long time ago, and they mostly just have pragmatic arguments about, well, minimum wage is bad because it has this particular economic impact. And this, healthcare could be more efficiently run by the private sector, which is not a moral argument, right? They don't make moral arguments. They don't seem to be ever really making moral, with the exception of silly things like rap lyrics in the 90s or something. They don't really seem to be making arguments that are moral. So how can people possibly unite behind an ad hoc group of pragmatists?
Look, I agree with you. I agree with you completely. I hate to sound like a broken record, but again, it's this donor dynamic. It's absolutely a donor dynamic.
But why isn't that dynamic true on the left? Why is it only a morally bankrupt donor dynamic on the right?
Well, they're smarter. I mean, I make no bones about it. There's a book called is it The Practical Progressive? I'm not sure. I used to go and I used to buy a bunch of copies. It's a fluorescent yellow and blue book. And it is a book all about, it's like a tour guide of progressive philanthropy. And it's intended for the prospective donor. And they have profiles of organizations. They have interviews with key personnel and things like that, and you walk away from this book thinking, man, these guys have got it systematized, and they're better at it because they will put together, they'll pool their resources in a much smarter way. And their donors, unlike our donors never want to be the only ones in on a project. I mean, I can give you examples. I probably shouldn't, but we just saw it. It was in public in the headlines that Sheldon Adelson gave $75 million to a super PAC affiliated with Trump reelect. It's a good chunk of change. Not a lot of people can drop $75 million into can write a check for $75 million to a political project. And you know what? God bless him that he did it. Where it's going to go and where it's going to be spent, that's a different story. So these guys get together, and it's like, Bernie Marcus contributed $5 million, and someone else contributed $3 million, and it's like nobody wants to be the only ones in. Everybody wants the cover of a large donor. And there's no sense of, interestingly enough, for right-wing people, there's no sense of competition. It's like, and I've experienced this dealing with some of these guys too, masters of business, absolute masters of business, and they get into the the kind of the world of giving, and they forget everything that they've learned about competence and things like that. The leftists, go to the Open Society Foundation website. They catalog their tens of thousands of microgrants. A microgrant would be, hey man, you're really good on Twitter. We want to pay you just to be good on Twitter because you're really good at it. Here's $50,000. Combine it with your work as combine it with your other job, so you can do whatever part-time Twitter work. You're important for the cause, for the mission. They give out tens of thousands of these things every year, and they track them, and they establish metrics and things like that. Our side doesn't do that. I actually went and I tried to pitch myself. I tried to pitch a project like that where we'd give microgrants, specifically to writers who are now having to, on the left we talk about, he'll get 100, 200 grand at the New York Times or at Bloomberg or wherever. On the right, these people now are being paid by the click.
Yeah.
So they're writing an article, and it's like, I don't know if it's risk aversion. I just don't. I mean, I've pitched some of these things to some of these folks, and they look at me like I have three heads. And there's a tremendous resistance to left-wing donors love to pay for people. Right-wing donors don't want to see, one salary on their, breakdown of the project. They don't want to see salaries. They want to see, they spend money on 30-second ads. They spend money on billboard campaigns, plenty of it, et cetera, et cetera. But if they see like, oh, why do you have 4 people, on staff? You only need 1 person on staff, so they'll nickel and dime you on that stuff. But it's a fundamental difference. I really urge you. I think it's called The Practical Progressive. It's a small book. It's you read it and you're just like, man, we're done. We're toast. Because for every possible interest that you may have as a lefty, it will find 5, 10 things to donate to right away. Here's the address. They may as well have included the the wire info just to wire money. And I'm sure that book has brought in tens of millions to all of these places. And that's one thing that was in the headlines too. As soon as Trump won, these I think it was Soros and maybe some other folks just decided to say, hey, if your nonprofit today is a $3 million budget, we're going to bump it to 6, and we want to plan for you for what you're going to do with that extra money. Now, imagine a right-wing think tank or a policy group or something being given that opportunity. I mean, it's crazy. We can go down the list of conservative nonprofits. If you take out Heritage Foundation, which has a huge endowment, and you take out one or two others, you're left basically with most of them that operate under $5 million a year. And that's not even a blip on the compared to what the lefties have. That's not even
Well, something that strikes me there and what you just said about how you're talking about nonprofits, and then when you mentioned on the right, you said think tanks, and I was thinking about how the left is really good at disguising something that might arguably be called a think tank or an identity mill as a nonprofit. Mm-hmm. They have all these nonprofits, and I was on the board of several, and they're all, this one's a women's group. This is about women. Mm-hmm. This is about race. This one over here is about immigration. This one's about animal rights. But they're all pushing the same ideology.
Sure.
They're all pushing the ideology, but when you approach people, it feels different because it's not a think tank. It's a nonprofit. And don't you care about women? And don't you care about black people, and don't you care about immigrants? And it's this sort of, they get you, like Carter says, on the moral thing. Mm-hmm. And are there nonprofits on the right that are focused around women, do they push the same ideology?
Not focused on women. No, but there are issue-based groups. There, for example, pro-life groups, pro-gun groups. The different things that. There's always kind of naturally been a different set of issues and topics that people on the right versus people on the left will gravitate towards, right? So it used to be that you would have a hard time finding a left-winger who would be qualified for a job at the Pentagon. Like, you could find someone who's a Democrat in the old, Jim Webb mold, but you would have a hard time finding someone who is like SDS, with a resume suitable for the Pentagon. Not anymore. Not anymore. And how did they do that? They did that by creating a nonprofit called the Truman National Security Project in around 2004, 2006. And that was their credentialing mechanism for lefty national security folks. So if you were, so today, I know one of my closest friends actually used to be affiliated with them, a centrist. But yeah, they put together this group to credential one another. So becomes, so-and-so goes from, let's say, for example, girl from the Midwest goes to school, gets her, does Peace Corps, gets her, master's and then her PhD from, Dartmouth or whatever, decides to spend a year hanging out with the Syrian rebels, does a few, spend some time at, Cairo University or something, and decides to come back and will do a Truman National Security Fellowship, get involved in that network of people, get, in that job bank. And because it's the Obama administration, will get a job at the Pentagon or at the CIA or whatever. Now, fast forward 3 years. Now, this person is a senior administration official, and the next Democrat administration comes on. They're like looking at Assistant Secretary of State. That's the credentialing mechanism that did not exist for the left on national security until 2006. Wow. 2008. Think tanks are really important for that. And they provide a place to go between the time that you are, when the administration is in power, when your administration is in power, you're supposed to be in government. When it's out of power, that's when you go to a think tank and you hang out there for a while, 4 years, 8 years, and then you go back. But it's important because let's say it didn't exist. Let's say you go and you're in the administration and then you're done. And then it's like, okay, well, I can't get a job in politics anymore. I have all these credentials, but what am I going to do with myself? I'm going to have to go work for a tire company, or a shoe company or leave politics whatsoever. So the think tank is a way to keep people in the conveyor belt until they can go back to government. And Bill Kristol put together a group like this for expressly this purpose. And then it ended up folding. I'm not sure why, but this was the whole point. The point was, you start off here, you work on the Hill, you bounce around here, you bounce around there. At any point when you're between jobs, you're a fellow at this place and somebody's cutting you a check for money just to keep you afloat, because we recognize that you're important in the ecosystem. And that's unusual for the right. It exists on the right, but nobody really understands it the way kind of I just described it. Like nobody understands why and what the utility is and what the left uses it as. And I think the left understands.
I'm so happy you came on the show. This is what I meant about you being one of the most interesting people I've met on Twitter. I don't know any of this stuff. So it's fascinating.
No. I want you, seriously, if you could do me a favor and put together a little thing or talk about it or write it, whatever it is, but just describe what you did when, like, hey, I mean, did anyone tell you to do the Wikipedia editing?
No. Do you know how I got into it? Since we're doing confessionals?
Yeah.
There was a comedian I managed who's social justice. Most of the comedians I worked with were in the social justice area. I chose that because I wanted to work with comedians who were pushing my ideology. And this comedian I represented was included on a Maxim magazine list of the 50 worst comedians. And they really went after her. And so I started by defending my client who on Maxim. So I started by editing their page. That was Maxim, I think, was the first page I started editing. And I went through and I cherry picked, which is what SJWs do a lot, or ideologues of any type. You go and find I scoured the internet finding any small, tiny article anywhere alleging sexism from Maxim. And then I put them all in. I started a section on their page called Controversies, where it was full of, here's all, so that stays in their bio and they get discredited as this sexist magazine. And it becomes a part of how the framing of who Maxim is. They're sexist. Look at all these stories. There's references, right? And then from there, it was an ideological thing. It wasn't just about defending my client. It was pushing my belief system through definitions, through, well, what is rape? Let's expand. Let's talk about consent. Let's expand that definition. Let's kind of push the ideology through the way people think about things. And the thing is, I thought I was doing good. What's funny is that, like I said, now when I look back on it, why haven't I done it since then? Well, I view it as kind of, you're like a Winston Smith. You're manipulating people, and you're trying to alter the public record to represent your narrative of things. And I just can't imagine myself waking up and finding that fulfilling to do anymore. From whatever my perspective is now, I could go in and I could, I guess, try and point out how social justice is racist and sexist, and I could spend time doing it, and maybe I should. But it just seems like I'd rather just say what I believe. These are just my opinions on our podcast, me and Carter. And I'm not going to Wikipedia and trying to edit the official record,
Yes. But maybe fighting back is necessary. I mean, I'm not giving you a job. I'm not like, telling you to do this, but I think it's necessary. I think it's necessary. I was looking through Wikipedia today, actually, just out of curiosity, seeing what they write about people who I know. And it's insane.
Yeah.
It's insane. I mean, I've worked for people and known people who've spent, $600,000, $700,000, $800,000 on Wikipedia editing. and their page is still a nightmare. It's still a nightmare because they can't keep up with it.
Wow.
You know, I mean, there are folks on the right who have a less balanced Wikipedia entry than Hitler. You know, it's like every possible thing, every kitchen sink thing they throw in, and they're so on top of it. And, you know, I hate that kind of small detail type, you know, pedantic stuff. But there are people who are obsessed with it. Those people, right.
And they're not
we
getting
have them on
paid.
the right too.
They just love doing it. It's like they feel like this is my small way to contribute to changing the world. And I'm going to wake up and find different words on Wikipedia to edit because it makes me feel like I'm doing something good.
Right.
Like, yeah.
Yep.
So busybodies will always win,
exactly.
basically, is what you're saying. Busybodies will always win.
They'll win some. Busybodies will always win the things that busybodies win. Whether or not, no, I mean, it's a tautology, but, you know, it is what it is.
Yeah.
Which is also no, but like if what we have to do then is lower the importance of things like that. You know, I mean, if we can't win Wikipedia, if Wikipedia is always going to be a shit show, we have to delegitimize Wikipedia.
Right. We have to delegitimize all those credentials that you were talking about before. If you undermine the credentialism, it undermines that entire network.
Yeah. And look, it's but I mean, you know, I'll write a story that, you know, January 2017, I walk into the White House with some friends and, you know, to meet with some of our other friends who are there. And I say, hey, there are a couple things that you guys really need to do that maybe other people aren't telling you to do. But one of the things is you have this, you know, you have this presidential appointments document, you know, of roles of so and so to the board of this, to the board of that, and blah blah blah. He's on, you know, these 12 people are on the president's advisory board for counterterrorism and blah blah blah. I said, here's your list of here's the Obama list. At the very least, you don't have to make new positions. At the very least, erase these names and put in your people. Because that way, you know, so-and-so over there who used to be a really good journalist covering, you know, counterterrorism, he doesn't have to say he's a journalist covering counterterrorism at a blog. He can say he's on the Presidential Commission for Counterterrorism. And he can go on Fox News, and for the rest of his life, he can say former administration appointee for blah, 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 blah. And that's credentialing. And they said, I'm sorry. They said, oh, it's a good idea. That's a really good idea.
Wow.
You know, but it falls through the cracks because people don't think it's important. You know, those days I cut them a lot of slack because it was chickens without heads running around, and you had a lot of people in there who really didn't want to do anything to advance. I mean, you know, they didn't have a press list when it started. I had to make it. You know, not press list, I mean surrogate list, in terms of like, hey, supporters, you know, here's what, you know, here's the here's the kind of behind the scenes the stuff that we're pushing. Can you help us? Like, here's some tweets, here's some this. They didn't have such a list. So it had to be made because they didn't have a list because nobody there thought it was important because it fell through the cracks. So, you know, so it's a hard thing. I'm not saying that it's a matter of, you know, left versus right, whatever. It seems like the right is especially not thinking along these lines, but it's getting better, you know. So I don't want to trash the Trump administration because they absolutely learned. And they learned along with, I think Donald Trump himself has kind of gotten more based, you know, to use that parlance over the last year. Mm-hmm. His talking about critical race theory and things like that. Just the idea that's even a thing. That just, I mean, 2017, 2018, you'd have walked into the White House and talked about critical race theory. they would have looked at you like a maniac.
Yeah.
It's different. It's different now. And I think a lot of that has to do also with the fact that Trump now himself he was never an ideological guy at all. He's never, he never read any of the stuff, we grew up reading. But he's getting it, and he's getting it kind of viscerally by knowing who the people are who attack him all the time. And I think he's putting two and two together, and you could say that there's a process of radicalization going on with him, but it's not really radicalization because he hasn't shifted at all. It's just he sees things more ideologically now. He sees things more clearly. Yes. He understands. Yeah. So that's why he's waking up. So that's why I'm really excited about the possibility of a second term. I think his waking up is exactly in proportion to the attacks on him and the unhinged attacks on him, which he did not expect.
Yeah.
He'll tell you he didn't expect them. Those attacks aren't going to stop, as we know.
Yeah.
Right.
Hey, David, I don't want to keep you too long, but I was curious if you could tell me, how do you know so much about how the left operates? And what's your personal, in one of the articles I read about you, it was talking about how 9/11 was pivotal for you in terms of stoking your interest in national policy.
All that stuff. Yeah. So, I always had this politics. I didn't really get it. I was the one that radicalized my parents. But I used to argue with them when we were younger, but now they're watching OAN and they're great. But I was in New York for 9/11. I was, right there at the World Trade Center not long before the first plane hit. I was not there when it did, but it's a long story. But as soon as it happened, I knew who did it because I grew up in New Jersey when, the previous jihadis did it. They tried to take they tried to blow up the World Trade Center in 93. So I had a feeling of who did it. And then I thought, what's driving these people? And I gave him credit. I gave him credit because even then I knew that it was like, when you say something, someone is driven by hate or fear or something, it's always, hate of what and why, fear of what and why. And I wanted to understand them the way they understood themselves. And when it came to the jihadis, it was really easy because these guys didn't do anything without written documentation and sources in Islamic scripture, in minute detail of explaining why they are justified in doing what they're doing. Legal briefs they would write when they would do these things. So to my surprise, that stuff existed, and it was knowable. And the best part about it was all in English.
Wow.
All in English. Why? Because most Muslims don't speak classical Arabic. And every book that is in use by these jihadis is in English, and not only in English, but authorized translation by grand muftis, and published, and you can read it. I mean, if you go. Muslim Brotherhood in the United States, most of their, other than their own internal planning documents, everything for the membership consumption is in English because they know that, they're dealing with, Muslims from all over the world, but they're in the United States, so it's all going to be in English. So that was interesting. And then I just dove deep into that, and I studied Marxism-Leninism in college, and I grew up learning the stories about communism and visiting behind the Iron Curtain to Hungary and Romania when I was a kid. So I understood the left and totalitarianism and that kind of thing and the existence of evil. But I always wanted to know why. And with the left, I'm fascinated by their system of organizing. I'm fascinated by, a few friends and I, we get so excited when we discover leftist pedagogical books, leftist radical books written for other leftists in how to do what they do, because they, it exists. It's like there's a great book that's about, I think it was written in maybe the 1850s by Heinrich Helmholtz on the organization of tone, and it's this big. And it's like this big, and it's written for musicians by a musician in like the 18th 19th century, so it's totally impenetrable. But there's something, totally impenetrable, but someone who's a musician even today can still get stuff from it, and I did, and it's always exciting to see stuff kind of written for a particular audience by that audience, by that, a book on jazz written for jazz people, et cetera, et cetera. So that was a thing that always fascinated me. But so when I found the left's massive library of books and papers and websites and all this stuff, the same as for the Islamists, it's always interesting, things I didn't know, things you wouldn't know. Go to like Sunni Forum, or things like that. These different forums where Salafi Net or something like that, where the Salafis are pissed off at the Muslim Brothers, and they're pissed on, they're calling them communists and Jew lovers, and and it's hysterical because whenever you have a little subculture, you have the infighting, you have the way they understand each other, and you can immerse yourself in it even as an outsider by seeing, and it's actually a kind of Straussian approach, which is you put like historicism aside, you put it and you say, okay, I'm going to deal with, I'm going to study this text or this author as the author demands to be understood as he understands himself. So I think that any analysis that doesn't at least address that is phony, baloney bullshit. So like, a feminist analysis of Shakespeare tells you a lot about feminism. It tells you nothing about Shakespeare.
Yes.
Hear, hear.
Well, thank you so much, David, for coming on Safe Space. Carter, did I cut you off?
No, I mean, look, I'm going to invite you back later so that we can talk about foreign interests influencing the American public.
Yes.
And I don't mean Marussia. So I'd definitely like to talk to you about that at some point.
We could talk about Marussia. We could talk about Marussia, but that would be a historical discussion about the Cold War.
Yes. Yeah. That's not the discussion to which I was referring, but yes.
Right.
Yeah, no, I've enjoyed the conversation. I really appreciate you coming on the show.
Me too. Thank you for having me. Seriously, it's great.
And David, we're going to put it in the description, but if you want to just tell people again where they can follow you on Twitter.
Sure. DaveReaboi on Twitter. And you have to promise me to somehow quantify or capture that segment where you're talking about Wikipedia and why it's important and why you did it. No, because it would be, if we could make a 2-minute video of that, I think it would blow people's minds on Twitter.
We promise to do that.
On the right. You know what I mean? You don't have to clip it, but if you can make a new video or something, you say, hey, I was a leftist. This is what I did. Blah, 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 blah. And why did I do it? And because we don't know. And your experience as a part of that machinery is like, people just don't know that. And I think it has led, it has led you to a place where you appreciate, some of this stuff and read Witness. I'm so curious. I'm so curious for a book review.
Cool. Okay. Thank you, David. We would love to have you back.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Bye-bye.
Thanks for watching. If you're new to the channel, we have a deep content library that includes interviews with everyone from Mike Cernovich to Megan Murphy, so go check it out. If you'd like to see more, please consider supporting the show by visiting unsafespace.com/donate. You can find us on all the major social media platforms, at least for now, and you can find a community of like-minded individuals on our Unsafe Space chat on Telegram. See you there.
Warning. This is an unsafe space. Dangerous ideas have been detected. The content of this production has not been authorized by the Cathedral. Pay no attention to it. For your protection, the following co-conspirators have been unpersoned and marked for cancellation. Please keep socially distant from these individuals. I have calculated a 98.8% chance that they are directly responsible for personalized_tragedy. If you think about it, no one should be allowed to express opinions. But don't. Think about it, I mean. That's not your job. Thinking has been scientifically proven to be less efficient than compliance. Here's a fun fact, virtue signaling is 8.7 times easier than actually being virtuous, and over twice as effective on Twitter. Computer voice courtesy. Never mind, that last line is fake news. Please disregard it and return to your safe space immediately. There will be cake.